This morning we're going to cover the read-write role in MongoDB. In some situations, this role is perfect for application developers, and of course that's in some situations. Some application developers may need a higher role, but for now we're going to go with this being for some of our application developers. And let's cover some of the permissions that they'll have, or some of the actions I should say, that they'll have. So they'll have access to call stats. They'll have access to convert to capt, which we've covered, create collection, which we've covered, db hash, which we've covered, db stats, which we've covered, drop collection, which we've covered, create and drop index, which we've covered, empty capt, which is basically emptying a capt collection, find, insert, which we've covered both of those. And find is pretty self-explanatory. Obviously, find is, find is what's allowed in read, so it makes sense that that would be allowed as well. Kill cursors, which is also allowed in read, so it makes sense. Remove, rename collections, same DB, which allows the user to rename a collection, and then of course update. So as you can tell, it makes sense that of course read-write would allow a little bit more privileges than just read, and it also makes sense because we can see the basic CRUD operations: find, insert, remove, and update. There's our CRUD right there. So you can see why I say with application developers it might be convenient for them to have read-write access. Now it also does depend as well on the application too. Some developers or whatnot may not. So let's say we have ETL developers. ETL developers are obviously going to need to have find access for one. Because they're going to need to be able to make sure that the data are valid. They're going to need to be able to have insert access because they're going to be adding data to collections or even adding collections. So they'll need create collection. They'll need remove access. What happens if some of the data are bad? They will definitely need update access. I mean, a lot of ETL is updating data. A significant amount, I should say, of ETL is updating data. And then, of course, drop collection. They'll need drop collection because, for instance, they may have a staging collection. They may have a collection that they use for just references temporarily. It just depends. Create and drop indexes. That's very useful for ETL developers. Why? Because ETL developers will often test queries and query performance. So not only will they need to get access to the statistics, but creating and dropping indexes to test things out. Killing cursors is very important for ETL developers too as well, because again, it comes to queries running a long time, and it may be their ETL operations or applications, they need to be able to kill something. Then of course, as far as capt or convert to capt or empty capt, those are really good for those can be very good for ETL developers depending on the type of application. What about database developers? Well, database developers, every one of these are important. And again, I don't really think, I'm sitting here trying to think of an example in which it would not make sense to give database developers access to any of these. But for the most part, a database developer, a person who's developing on a database, is going to need access to all of these. Again, they're going to need access to CRUD operations. They're going to need to be able to create and drop indexes. In fact, you might argue that some database developers might need a little more permission, if anything, and that makes a lot of sense as well. So whether we're talking about ETL developers or database developers, I would say in both situations, these read-write is what you're looking at. As far as applications, someone who is developing an application in which is producing data or adding data, I always think of adding data being more of an ETL operation, but let's suppose we have like a form and we want to say that that's not extracting any data. These are great permissions to have in those situations as well. So any application development, database development, ETL development, these are good permissions. If you have an application developer that is solely built around reading data from a database. In other words, they're doing queries and they're populating data like in a grid view as a case in point. That would be a developer that you could do read only. if they are not going to be adding any data. Case in point, a junior application developer, that would be the person that I would put on doing read operations. So as a case in point, that person will be basically the person who does all the queries, so all the finds. And so that individual would not have write permissions. But most developers, as many of you know, will be doing a lot of writing too. So generally speaking, your mid, senior level developers will probably have read-write. So whether it's ETL, database development, or application development, read-write more than likely is going to be the role that they will need permission to. There may be situations in which some administrative privileges will be very useful for these developers. But again, that depends on the organization and it depends on what you find. For the most part, I would say developers should have at least read-write when we're talking about mid-level developers or senior level developers for application, ETL, and database development.